When my golden child brother Trey turned 15, my parents bought him a brand new Chevrolet. When I turned 15, my mother handed me a bus pass and told me it builds character. Grandpa Pops overheard it all from his recliner in the corner. He did not say a word. He just waited. Now, 13 years later, on my 28th birthday, a massive heavy-duty tow truck screeched into my parents' suburban driveway, and everything changed. My name is Audrey, and before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. You will definitely want to stick around to see exactly how this birthday present destroyed their perfect facade. Growing up, the double standard in our house was not just obvious, it was suffocating. My parents, Valerie and Derek, obsessed over their image at our local church. They presented us as the perfect upstanding family. But behind closed doors, every ounce of their affection and financial support was funneled directly to Trey. He was the son, the supposed carrier of the family legacy, even though he dropped out of college and still lived rent-free in his childhood bedroom at 31. Meanwhile, I was the designated scapegoat. I was expected to be quiet, to serve, and to be grateful for the bare minimum. I learned early on that complaining only resulted in my mother delivering long lectures about respect and traditional values. So I stopped complaining. I quietly built a highly lucrative online vintage fashion business right from my laptop. I saved my money. I kept my mouth shut. And I waited for the day I could finally break free. The morning of my 28th birthday started exactly like any other day in that house. There were no balloons, no cake, and certainly no heartfelt wishes. Instead, the kitchen was chaotic with wedding preparations. Trey was getting married to Chelsea, a woman whose entitlement perfectly matched his own. Chelsea loved to make subtle cutting remarks about my life, viewing anything I had as somehow belonging to her and Trey by default. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, my mother Valerie did not even look up from the floral arrangement brochures. She casually mentioned that since I was not doing anything important with my life, I needed to spend my weekend picking up dry cleaning for the bridal party. Trey sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone, complaining that the dealership was bothering him about some paperwork for his car. Not once did anyone acknowledge what day it was. I just took a sip of my coffee and looked out the window. I knew something they did not know. I knew about the trust Grandpa Pops had set up before he passed away. I just did not know exactly how it was going to arrive. The deep vibrating hiss of heavy air brakes suddenly interrupted the quiet suburban morning. The sound was so loud and out of place that the windows in the kitchen literally rattled in their frames. Derek marched into the room, complaining about the noise, demanding to know who was disrupting the neighborhood. We all walked out onto the front porch to investigate. A massive heavy-duty tow truck was blocking the entire driveway. The truck was painted a deep, imposing metallic blue, and along the side, massive silver letters spelled out, "Lincoln Towing and Salvage." That was the empire Grandpa Pops had built from the ground up. My mother stood on the porch, holding her favorite ceramic coffee mug, her face twisted in a mixture of confusion and annoyance. She hated anything that drew attention to the house in a way she could not control. Trey and Chelsea followed us out, Chelsea already whining about the exhaust fumes ruining the fresh morning air. Before the driver could even speak, Chelsea let out an ear-piercing squeal. "Oh my God, Trey, look!" she screamed, grabbing his arm and jumping up and down. "Your parents actually did it. They got you the vintage car for the wedding photos." Chelsea did not even wait for an explanation. She marched right down the driveway, completely ignoring me, and confidently approached the driver. "Thank you so much for dropping it off early," she said, holding her hand out expectantly. "Just give me the keys. I want to sit in it." The driver looked at Chelsea as if she had just spoken an alien language. He slowly lowered his clipboard, stepped around her outstretched hand, as if she was nothing more than a traffic cone, and walked directly toward me. He stopped right in front of where I was standing on the lawn. He removed his sunglasses and looked me dead in the eye, completely ignoring my father, who was now demanding to know what was going on. "Are you Audrey, the driver?" asked his voice booming and clear over the morning breeze. I simply nodded, feeling my heart begin to race in my chest. A slow, deeply respectful smile spread across his weathered face. "Happy 28th birthday, ma'am," he said. He reached to his belt, unclipped a heavy silver ring, holding a single set of keys, and placed them firmly into my palm. Then he pointed a thick finger toward the back of the heavy-duty flatbed. Sitting there, strapped down and gleaming under the morning sun, was a pristine, perfectly restored 1967 Shelby GT 500. The classic muscle car was an absolute masterpiece of American engineering, radiating pure power, flawless design, and untouchable wealth. For a long, agonizing moment, there was absolute, breathless silence. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that happens right before a massive storm breaks. Then a sharp, violent crash shattered the peace. My mother Valerie had dropped her coffee mug. It smashed against the hard concrete of the porch, sending shards of ceramic and hot coffee splashing directly onto her pristine white tennis shoes. She did not even flinch. She did not look down. Her eyes were locked onto the keys in my hand, and then up to the magnificent car on the truck, her jaw literally unhinged in pure, unadulterated shock. The birthday gift had finally arrived, and it was the match that would burn their entire kingdom to the ground. Chelsea was the first to break the heavy silence that hung over the driveway. She let out a high-pitched squeal that grated against my ears and started jumping up and down on the damp morning grass. "Oh my God, Trey," she yelled, clapping her hands together. "Your parents actually did it. They got you the vintage car for the wedding photos." She did not even wait for anyone to confirm her delusion. She marched right past my mother, who was still staring at the spilled coffee around her shoes, and strutted up to where I was standing. Chelsea held out her hand, palm up, and snapped her fingers at me. "Hand over the keys, Audrey," she commanded with that sickeningly sweet tone she always used when she wanted something. "Trey needs to see how the leather feels, and you are just holding up the show." I looked at Chelsea and her outstretched hand, and then looked at Trey, who was already puffing out his chest with an arrogant smirk on his face. He really believed this $250,000 masterpiece was his, just because he existed. I did not say a single word to Chelsea. I simply stepped around her, walking right past her outstretched hand. I approached the back of the Shelby GT 500 as the tow truck driver lowered the hydraulic ramp. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I slid the silver key into the trunk lock and turned it. The heavy metal popped open with a satisfying click. Chelsea huffed in frustration behind me, crossing her arms loudly. "What are you doing?" she whined. "Do not touch the interior. You are going to get your cheap perfume all over Trey's new car." I completely ignored her and lifted the trunk lid. Sitting right in the center of the pristine carpeted trunk was not a spare tire or a set of jumper cables. It was a worn, heavy brown leather briefcase. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact same briefcase Grandpa Pops carried with him to his office every single day for over 40 years. The leather was scuffed at the corners and the brass buckles were slightly tarnished, but to me, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. I undid the brass clasps and flipped the briefcase open. Inside sat a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy blue seal. The front page bore the official letterhead of Grandpa Pop's estate lawyer. I pulled the documents out and began to read the bold print on the first page out loud, so that everyone in the driveway could hear perfectly. It was a formal transfer of assets. Grandpa Pops had not just left me the 1967 Shelby. He had legally transferred 100% ownership of the Lincoln towing and salvage empire directly to me upon my 28th birthday. The land, the fleet of heavy-duty trucks, the commercial city contracts, and the multi-million-dollar business bank accounts were all solely in my name. For a second, nobody moved. Even the tow truck driver stood silently by his cab, watching the family dynamic unfold with a knowing look in his eye. Then my mother snapped out of her shock. Valerie's face turned a dark mottled red as she lunged forward, grabbing my arm, with her manicured fingernails digging deep into my skin. "You are lying!" she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute panic. "Give me those papers right now, Audrey." My father Pops was senile when he wrote that. He did not know what he was doing. He would never leave a commercial business to a girl who sells used clothes on the internet. I calmly peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. "He knew exactly what he was doing, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "He knew that if he left the company to you or Dad, it would be bankrupt within a year to pay for your country club memberships and church donations just to keep up appearances." Trey's face had drained of all its smugness. He looked like a toddler who had just dropped his ice cream on the sidewalk. "But I am the oldest," he stammered, taking a step toward me. "I am the son. That company is my birthright. You have to give it to me." Valerie immediately rushed to Trey's side, placing a protective hand on his chest, as if I had just physically attacked him. "Listen to your brother Audrey," she ordered, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are going to sign those papers over to Trey this afternoon. He is getting married. He is the man of the house. He needs the financial stability of the family business to support his new wife and build his legacy. You are being completely selfish and trying to ruin his big day out of pure jealousy." Chelsea nodded vigorously, chiming in with her usual entitlement. "Exactly, Audrey," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me. "We have a massive wedding to pay for and a future family to think about. You are single, and you do not need all of this responsibility. Just hand over the briefcase and stop being so dramatic. It is honestly embarrassing how you always try to make everything about yourself." I looked at the three of them, standing there, a unified front of greed and deep delusion. They honestly believed they could just bully me into handing over a multi-million-dollar empire, just like they had bullied me into giving up my childhood bedroom, giving up my college fund, and giving up my peace of mind for my entire life. They thought I would just fold under their pressure to keep the peace. But I was not that 15-year-old girl with a bus pass anymore. I placed the legal documents back inside the leather briefcase and snapped the brass buckles shut. I placed the briefcase back into the trunk of the Shelby and slammed the heavy lid down, locking it securely. I pulled the key out and dropped it right into the front pocket of my jacket. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. "The business is mine. The car is mine. And if any of you try to touch my property, I will have you arrested for grand theft." I turned my back on them, leaving my mother screaming my name, and walked calmly toward the street. The war had officially started. That evening, the atmosphere inside the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. I had retreated to my bedroom to avoid the endless shouting coming from the kitchen. I was sitting on my bed reviewing the business documents when I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening. A few moments later, my father Derek knocked sharply on my door. He did not ask if he could come in. He simply ordered me to come down to the living room immediately because we had a special guest. I knew exactly what that meant. I walked down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the living room. It was set up perfectly to look like a serious family intervention. Sitting right in the center on Grandpa Pop's old favorite armchair was Pastor Thomas. He was a towering figure in our community and the head of the church my parents attended every Sunday. My parents constantly used him as a weapon of moral authority whenever they wanted to force compliance from me. Valerie was sitting on the sofa next to Trey, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. Derek stood behind them with his arms crossed, trying to look like a stern patriarch. Trey was slouching in the corner, looking like a victim who had just been robbed. Pastor Thomas offered me a warm and deeply condescending smile as I stood in the doorway. "Have a seat, Audrey," he said in his deep, booming, preaching voice. "We need to have a serious conversation about the spirit of this family and the dangerous path you are walking down." I did not sit down. I leaned against the doorframe and waited for the performance to begin. Pastor Thomas folded his hands together and began a long, rehearsed sermon. He talked about the importance of grace and forgiveness. He told me that family was a sacred bond created by higher powers, and that holding on to worldly possessions out of spite was a sin that would poison my soul. He looked me right in the eye and said that Grandpa Pops clearly made a mistake in his old age. He insisted that the right thing to do, the Christian thing to do, was to sign the business over to Trey. He said Trey was about to become a husband and a father, and he desperately needed the Lincoln towing legacy to provide for his new family and establish himself as a man. He told me I was young and I had plenty of time to figure my own life out without taking food out of my brother's mouth. He actually used the word selfish to describe a woman claiming her own legal inheritance. When I did not immediately agree or drop to my knees in repentance, Valerie escalated her performance. She let out a loud dramatic sob and buried her face in her hands. "She is just jealous, Pastor," my mother cried out, her voice trembling with fake agony. She has always been jealous of Trey and Chelsea. She is trying to ruin his beautiful wedding just because she is unhappy with her own life and refuses to find a good man. She is tearing this family apart over a piece of paper out of pure spite. Derek nodded firmly, agreeing with her theatrical display. "You are embarrassing us, in front of the entire congregation, Audrey," my father added. "You need to stop this childish rebellion right now, sign the papers and do what is best for the family name before you destroy everything we have built." I stood there listening to their highly coordinated attack. For 28 years, this exact tactic had worked on me. The guilt, the religious pressure, the community expectations had always forced me to shrink myself down and apologize for things I never even did. I used to cry when they told me I was tearing the family apart. But standing there with the keys to my grandfather's empire in my pocket, I felt absolutely nothing. I did not feel the need to defend myself. I did not feel the urge to scream or cry or explain my side of the story. The truth was, they did not want peace. They wanted my total submission so they could continue to fund their fake lifestyle and pamper their golden child. I did not say a single word to Pastor Thomas. I did not acknowledge my parents or look at my brother. I simply turned around and walked back down the hallway to my bedroom. I could hear them muttering to each other in the living room, assuming I had gone to cry or to fetch the briefcase to surrender my rights. Instead, I pulled my old canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet. I did not need much because I already had my own apartment that they knew nothing about, and everything I truly cared about was already safe. I packed a few essential toiletries, my laptop chargers, and a couple of changes of clothes. I zipped the bag shut and threw it over my shoulder. I walked back down the hallway and stepped into the living room one last time. Pastor Thomas was already standing up, looking expectant. Valerie had dropped the tissue and was waiting eagerly for me to hand over the legal documents. I walked right past them and stopped at the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans. I pulled out the faded, worn-out plastic bus pass that my mother had handed me on my 15th birthday while Trey was outside revving his new car. I tossed it onto the glass table. It landed with a soft plastic clatter right in front of my mother. "You can keep the character," I said, my voice dead calm in the quiet room. "I am taking the car." Before any of them could process what had just happened, I turned and walked out the front door. I heard Valerie shriek my name and Derek yell for me to come back, but I did not stop. I walked out into the cool evening air and marched straight to the 1967 Shelby GT 500. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy metal door shut, locking them all out. I slid the key into the ignition and turned it. The classic engine roared to life with a sound so powerful it practically shook the ground beneath the tires. I shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the driveway. I did not look back. I drove away, leaving them shouting on the front lawn as I headed toward my actual home and the beginning of their downfall. The drive from the suffocating suburbs to downtown felt like shedding a heavy, toxic layer of skin. I drove the 1967 Shelby GT 500 through the city streets, letting the low rumble of the classic engine clear my mind. The cool night air blew through the open windows, carrying away the stench of my parents' fake religious righteousness. They thought I was just driving around aimlessly, sleeping in my car, or begging a friend for a couch to crash on. They thought I was a helpless little girl who would eventually come crawling back to them begging for forgiveness. They had absolutely no idea that for the past 3 years, my online vintage clothing business had been generating a massive six-figure income. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of a luxury high-rise building right in the heart of the city. I parked the muscle car in my reserved spot, taking a long moment to run my hand over the pristine leather steering wheel. I grabbed my duffel bag and the heavy leather briefcase from the passenger seat. I walked past the security desk, nodding to the night guard, and rode the private elevator up to my penthouse apartment. As the doors opened to my spacious living room with its sleek modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline, I finally let out a deep breath. This was my real life. The quiet, obedient daughter, living in a cramped childhood bedroom, was just a character I played to survive their abuse. I walked over to the large marble kitchen island, dropped my bag, and gently set Grandpa Pop's briefcase down under the pendant lights. It was time to get to work. I unbuckled the worn leather straps and pulled out the thick stacks of legal documents, along with a heavy-duty company laptop that Pops always kept locked in his home office. I plugged the computer in and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, prompting me for a secure password. Grandpa Pops was a brilliant businessman, but he was also a creature of habit. I typed in the address of his very first tow yard and hit enter. The desktop materialized immediately. I clicked on the main financial server for Lincoln Towing and Salvage. What I saw on the screen completely took my breath away. I knew Pops was successful, but I had no idea the true overwhelming scale of his empire. There were millions of dollars spread across commercial bank accounts, government salvage contracts, and prime real estate holdings. But as I dug deeper into the transaction history, a very dark and pathetic pattern began to emerge. Over the past 5 years, there were hundreds of rejected withdrawal requests. My parents, Valerie and Derek, had been desperately trying to siphon money out of the corporate accounts behind his back. I scrolled through pages of denied wire transfers to elite country clubs, rejected payments for luxury island vacations, and blocked checks meant to cover my mother's expensive church donation pledges. Pops had caught on to their greed years ago. The records showed that he had completely frozen them out of the company finances, cutting off their supply of endless, unearned cash. He had changed the routing numbers, revoked their signatory access, and locked them out of the legacy they felt so entitled to. That was exactly why they were suddenly so desperate to force me to sign the company over to Trey. They were not just greedy, they were completely broke and drowning in their own hidden debt. Their entire upper-middle-class lifestyle was a fragile house of cards ready to collapse. I leaned back in my tall leather chair, rubbing my temples as I processed the sheer magnitude of their deception. They had paraded around our community, acting like wealthy, generous pillars of society, while secretly trying to bleed an old man dry. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen, scrolling through a secure encrypted folder labeled Personal Family Assets. Inside that folder was a specific subfolder that immediately caught my eye. It was titled simply Trey Chevy. My heart began to beat a little faster as I double-clicked the icon. A series of scanned financial documents filled the screen. For 13 years, my parents had bragged to the entire congregation and all of our extended relatives that they bought Trey his brand new Chevrolet in cash. They claimed it was a reward for him simply being their wonderful, obedient son. The documents on the screen told a completely different story. It was a standard financing agreement, with a terrible predatory interest rate. But that was not the most shocking part. I opened the most recent digital statement from the auto lender. The account was severely delinquent. The golden child prized car was exactly 6 months behind on payments. The total amount past due was staggering. I kept scrolling through the file and my eyes landed on an official court-authorized repossession order. The lender had grown tired of my parents dodging their phone calls and had contracted a local commercial towing agency to hunt down the vehicle and seize it immediately. I looked at the name of the contracted agency at the top of the repo order and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The lender had hired Lincoln Towing and Salvage to repossess my brother's car. Grandpa Pops had intercepted the order and quietly held it in the local system, waiting for the right moment to execute it. The repo order was still fully active, legally binding, and completely ready to go. And as of this morning, I was the sole legal owner and chief executive of Lincoln Towing. The car they used to humiliate me on my 15th birthday, the car Trey drove around town like a shiny trophy, was legally mine to take away whenever I wanted. I closed the laptop and looked out at the glowing city skyline. My parents thought they could use fake religious guilt to crush me, but they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their perfect facade. The following evening, I was sitting on my velvet sofa packaging a few high-end vintage dresses for shipping when my phone suddenly vibrated against the glass coffee table. The screen lit up with a bright red notification from the Lincoln Towing and Salvage Master Security System. It was a perimeter breach alert at the main commercial impound lot downtown. Grandpa Pops had upgraded the entire facility with military-grade motion sensors and high-definition night vision cameras just a few months before he passed away. I set down the silk dress I was folding and picked up my phone, opening the live security application. I tapped on the main gate camera feed and watched the crisp black and white video load. A dark sedan had parked illegally on the street just outside the massive chain-link fence topped with coils of razor wire. Two figures stepped out of the car and walked up to the heavy steel pedestrian gate. Even in the grainy night vision, I immediately recognized the oversized designer jacket and the arrogant swagger. It was my brother Trey. And walking right behind him, constantly checking her reflection in her phone screen, was Chelsea. I synced the audio feed from the external microphones to my phone speakers. Chelsea was whining about the gravel ruining her expensive heels. Trey told her to be quiet and pulled a massive pair of industrial bolt cutters from his jacket. I watched in absolute disbelief as my golden child brother clamped the heavy steel cutters onto the thick brass padlock securing the side gate. He strained and pushed until the lock snapped with a loud metallic crack. He pushed the gate open and led Chelsea directly into the restricted impound yard. They were not just trespassing, they were breaking and entering into a highly secure commercial facility. I quickly switched camera angles, tracking their movements as they navigated through the rows of repossessed cars and heavy-duty tow trucks. They walked with absolute confidence, acting as if they already owned the entire empire. They walked straight past the standard sedans and pickup trucks, heading deep into the high-value asset section of the lot. This was where Pops kept the luxury vehicles that had been seized from wealthy clients who defaulted on their massive loans. Trey stopped in front of a gleaming black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. It was a flagship luxury sedan worth well over $100,000. Chelsea let out a loud squeal of delight that echoed through the microphone. She ran her hands over the sleek hood of the car, completely ignoring the bright yellow impound sticker slapped across the windshield. "Oh my God, Trey. This is perfect," she said, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. "This is exactly the kind of car we need to pull up in for the wedding rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. Everyone from my family is going to be so jealous when they see us step out of this." Trey puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself for doing absolutely nothing. "I know, baby," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Audrey is throwing a little temper tantrum right now, but Mom and Dad said they are going to force her to hand over the keys and the business tomorrow. Pops built this place for me anyway. We might as well take this Mercedes out for a test drive tonight and show it off." I watched them through the camera as Trey pulled out a flashlight and started shining it through the driver's side window, looking for the keys that were securely locked in the main office safe. They honestly believed the world belonged to them. They believed they could just break into a legal impound lot, damage secure property, and steal a seized luxury vehicle without any consequences simply because they wanted to look rich for their rehearsal dinner. A few years ago, I would have panicked. I would have called my parents and begged them to come get Trey before he got into trouble. I would have tried to protect him from his own overwhelming stupidity out of some twisted sense of family loyalty. But as I sat in my penthouse apartment looking at the glowing screen, I felt absolutely no obligation to save him. He was a 31-year-old man committing a serious felony. I opened my laptop and logged into the remote management system for the impound lot. Pops had installed an electronic fail-safe system that allowed the yard to go into full lockdown mode in case of an active robbery. I typed in my administrator credentials and clicked the red lockdown icon. On the video feed, I heard the loud, heavy mechanical clank echo across the yard. The heavy steel deadbolts on the main gate and the pedestrian entrance automatically slammed shut, engaging massive magnetic locks that required a security keycard to release. Trey jumped at the noise, dropping his flashlight on the gravel. He turned around and jogged back toward the front gate, leaving Chelsea standing by the Mercedes. I switched back to the main entrance camera. Trey grabbed the metal bars of the pedestrian gate and pulled with all his might, but the magnetic lock held firm. He was completely trapped inside a fortress of razor wire and steel. He started panicking, pulling out his phone and frantically dialing a number. He was probably calling Valerie or Derek to come rescue him like they always did. But I was not going to let them sweep this under the rug. I did not call my parents, and I certainly did not call Trey to warn him. I calmly moved my mouse across the screen and clicked the silent alarm button. The system immediately dispatched an emergency alert directly to the local police department, reporting an active commercial burglary in progress with suspects trapped on site. There were no sirens and no warning lights, just a silent, invisible trap closing tightly around them. I leaned back in my velvet sofa, picking up my cup of tea. I watched the live feed for exactly 4 minutes before the dark street outside the impound lot was suddenly illuminated by the rapid flashing of bright red and blue lights. 3 police cruisers aggressively pulled up to the front gate, completely blocking Trey's dark sedan. My brother and his entitled fiancée were about to experience a massive reality check, and there was absolutely nothing our parents could do to save them. I took my time driving down to the Central Police Precinct. I drove the classic Shelby through the quiet city streets, letting the cool night breeze blow through the open windows. I wanted to give my brother and his entitled fiancée enough time to sit in the back of a squad car and truly absorb the cold, hard reality of their actions. They had spent their entire lives facing absolutely zero consequences, and tonight was going to be their very first lesson. When I finally walked through the heavy glass doors of the station, the scene unfolding inside was pure, absolute chaos. Trey and Chelsea were sitting on a hard wooden bench handcuffed to a metal rail. Chelsea was sobbing hysterically, her dark mascara running down her face and ruining her expensive designer silk outfit. Trey was arguing loudly with a tired-looking desk sergeant, demanding to be given his one phone call and threatening to sue the entire police department. Before I could even approach the front desk, the double doors behind me burst open. My mother, Valerie, and my father, Derek, stormed into the precinct, looking completely frantic and out of breath. Valerie marched straight past me, completely ignoring my presence, and slammed her hands down hard on the wooden counter of the front desk. "You need to release my son right this second," she screamed at the sergeant. "This is a massive misunderstanding. He is a good Christian man getting married this weekend, and you are treating him like a common street criminal." The sergeant did not even blink. He looked up from his paperwork and calmly explained that Trey and Chelsea had been caught on high-definition camera breaking the lock of a secure commercial facility and attempting to steal a seized luxury vehicle. Derek puffed out his chest and pointed a rigid finger at the officer. "That facility belongs to our family," Derek yelled, his voice echoing loudly through the small lobby. "Our father just passed away, and my son is the rightful heir to that business. He was just picking up a car for his wedding rehearsal. You have absolutely no right to hold him here." That was when Chelsea spotted me standing quietly near the entrance. She jumped up, rattling the heavy metal handcuffs against the rail. "There she is," Chelsea shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "That is my aggressive African-American sister-in-law. She is completely insane, officer. She locked us in that terrifying yard on purpose. She hates me because I am white, and she is just jealous of my life. She is trying to ruin my wedding. You need to arrest her right now for holding us hostage." Valerie whipped her head around and finally noticed me standing there. Her eyes widened with pure, unadulterated rage. She marched toward me, raising her hand as if she was actually going to strike me right there in the middle of the crowded police station. "You malicious little brat!" Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "Tell them right now. Tell them to drop these ridiculous charges and give your brother the keys to that lot. You have humiliated this family for the absolute last time." I did not step back, and I did not flinch. I reached into my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out the thick blue folder containing the notarized legal documents from Grandpa Pop's estate lawyer. I walked right past my screaming mother and placed the folder directly onto the high wooden counter in front of the desk sergeant. "My name is Audrey," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I am the sole legal owner and chief executive officer of Lincoln Towing and Salvage. The two individuals sitting on that bench broke into my private commercial property, destroyed a heavy brass security lock, and were actively attempting to steal a seized luxury Mercedes-Benz when the security system automatically locked them inside." The desk sergeant opened the folder and carefully reviewed the documents. He checked my driver license against the official ownership papers and nodded slowly. "Well, ma'am," the sergeant said, looking over his reading glasses at my parents, "it looks like your daughter here is the actual legal owner of the property. So the only question left tonight is whether or not she wants to officially press charges against these two." Trey's face suddenly went pale. He finally realized that his golden child status meant absolutely nothing inside this building. "Come on, Audrey," Trey pleaded, his voice cracking with sudden fear. "Do not do this to me. It was just a stupid joke. We were just going to borrow the car for one single night. You cannot send me to jail right before my wedding day." I looked at my brother sitting there in handcuffs. I thought about the bus pass, the constant belittling, the way they tried to steal my inheritance, and the way Chelsea had just tried to use a racist microaggression to turn the police against me. I turned back to the desk sergeant. "I want to press full charges," I said clearly so everyone in the room could hear. "Trespassing, destruction of private commercial property, and attempted grand theft auto. I will also be submitting the high-definition video and audio recordings from my security system tomorrow morning as hard evidence." Valerie let out a loud, dramatic wail and collapsed against Derek, grabbing his shirt. "You are an absolute monster," she cried. "You are sending your own flesh and blood to prison." Derek glared at me with pure hatred, but he quickly turned his attention back to the officer. "Fine," Derek said, pulling out his leather wallet with shaking hands. "Just tell us how much the bail is so we can get them out of here and deal with this ungrateful girl ourselves." The sergeant typed a few things into his computer terminal. "Given the severity of the charges, including attempted grand theft auto, the night magistrate has set their bail at $5,000 each," the sergeant announced without any emotion. "That is $10,000 total, required right now in cash or through a certified bondsman if you want them to walk out of those doors tonight." I watched the color completely drain from my father's face. His hand froze, holding his thin wallet in the air. I knew for an absolute fact from reading the company ledgers that they did not have $10,000 in cash. They were drowning in secret debt and maxed out credit cards just trying to pay for Chelsea's extravagant wedding party. Valerie stopped crying instantly and looked at Derek in sheer, wide-eyed panic. Derek slowly put his wallet away, muttering something under his breath about needing to make a phone call to the bank in the morning. Trey and Chelsea realized in that exact moment that they were not going home. They were going to spend the night before their expensive rehearsal dinner sleeping on a cold concrete floor in a holding cell. I picked up my blue folder, gave my stunned parents a polite little smile, and walked out of the precinct into the cool night air. The next morning, the bright sunlight streaming through my penthouse windows felt like a brand new beginning. I had slept better than I had in years, knowing that Trey and Chelsea were waking up on the uncomfortable metal bunks of a city holding cell. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. Today was not a day for celebrating just yet. I had a scheduled appointment at a prestigious downtown law firm to officially finalize the transfer of the Lincoln Towing and Salvage assets. I drove to the towering glass office building and took the private elevator up to the top floor. The receptionist guided me into a massive mahogany boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Waiting for me at the head of the long table was Mr. Caldwell. He was Grandpa Pop's personal estate lawyer and one of his oldest and most trusted friends. Mr. Caldwell stood up and shook my hand with a warm and deeply respectful grip. He told me that Pops had spoken highly of my business acumen and knew I was the only one strong enough to handle what was coming next. We spent the first hour signing the standard legal documents officially transferring the commercial real estate, the fleet of tow trucks, and the corporate bank accounts into my name. But as we finished the final stack of paperwork, Mr. Caldwell did not smile or offer congratulations. His face grew incredibly serious. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder, placing it carefully on the table between us. He folded his hands and looked me right in the eye. He told me that Pops had discovered a deeply disturbing secret a few months before he passed away, and he instructed Mr. Caldwell to hand over this specific file only after I had officially taken control of the company. My heart started to beat a little faster as I reached out and opened the folder. Inside was a massive stack of comprehensive financial records and credit reports. I frowned in confusion. I had always been incredibly careful with my personal finances. I built my online vintage business using cash and a separate corporate entity, so my personal credit report should have been practically blank. But the pages in front of me were completely covered in long columns of active debts, delinquent notices, and collection warnings. I scanned the top of the first page to make sure it was actually mine. There was my full legal name and my exact social security number. I started tracing the dates of the earliest open accounts. They were initiated exactly 10 years ago, just a few weeks after my 18th birthday. A cold wave of absolute horror washed over me as the truth began to sink in. When I turned 18, my parents did not just hand me a bus pass and tell me to build character. They secretly took my social security number and used it to open a massive web of fraudulent financial accounts. They committed deliberate and calculated identity theft against their own daughter. My hands actually shook as I turned the pages reading the specific line items of their betrayal. There it was in black and white. The original auto loan for Trey, Prize Chevrolet, was completely in my name. For 13 years, they had paraded that car around our community, acting like wealthy, generous parents, while quietly destroying my financial future to pay for it. But the car was only the beginning. There were 3 maxed-out platinum credit cards from high-end luxury department stores. I looked at the transaction histories and saw endless charges for designer clothes, expensive steakhouse dinners, and luxury resort vacations that Valerie and Derek had taken Trey on while leaving me home alone to watch the house. The final crushing blow was a recent installment loan from a high-end jewelry store. It was for a flawless 2-carat diamond. They had literally stolen my identity and ruined my credit to finance Chelsea's exorbitant engagement ring. I looked down at the bottom of the final page where the total outstanding balance was calculated in bold red ink. My parents had racked up over $85,000 of unsecured debt in my name. My personal credit score was completely destroyed, sitting at a dismal low that would prevent me from ever renting an apartment or buying a home under my own identity. I sat back in the heavy leather chair feeling a mixture of profound devastation and burning rage. It was one thing to be the least favorite child. It was one thing to be ignored on holidays or handed a plastic bus pass while my brother was handed the keys to a brand new car. But this was an entirely different level of evil. They had not just favored Trey. They had actively cannibalized my future to keep him comfortable. They treated my identity, my very existence, as nothing more than a convenient financial resource to fund a lavish upper-middle-class lifestyle they could not actually afford. Every time my mother lectured me about family loyalty and Christian values, she was secretly logging into online portals and forging my electronic signature to buy her golden child another expensive toy. Every time my father told me I needed to respect his authority, he was hiding past due notices from collection agencies that were legally hunting me down. Mr. Caldwell watched me process the massive betrayal with a deeply sympathetic expression. He poured me a glass of cold water and waited patiently for me to speak. He told me that Grandpa Pops was absolutely heartbroken when he discovered what Valerie and Derek were doing. Pops had hired a top-tier private investigator to dig up every single fraudulent document and trace every forged signature and internet protocol address directly back to the computer in my parents' living room. Pops had meticulously built an ironclad case against them. He had deliberately intercepted the repossession order for the Chevrolet and held it in the towing company system so I would have the ultimate leverage when the truth finally came out. Mr. Caldwell slid a fresh legal pad and a silver pen across the polished mahogany table toward me. He explained the severe legal reality of the situation in a very calm and measured voice. Because the identity theft was so extensively documented and involved massive bank fraud stretching across multiple financial institutions, it was classified as a severe federal offense. If I chose to file an official police report and submit the private investigator file as evidence, Valerie and Derek would not just face a simple fine. They would face immediate arrest, a high-profile criminal trial, and potentially years in a federal prison. He told me the choice was entirely mine to make, and that he would support whatever decision I felt was right for my healing. I looked down at the staggering $85,000 number glaring back at me in bold red ink. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. My parents' desperate panic at the police station last night when they could not afford the $10,000 bail. Their sudden aggressive demand that I sign over the towing company to Trey, the man of the house. They had planned to force me to surrender the multi-million-dollar commercial assets today so they could quickly liquidate the property and finally pay off the mountain of secret debt they had buried under my name. They thought they had trapped me in a perfect invisible cage. I reached out and closed the thick manila folder, resting my hand flat against the heavy paper. I looked up at Mr. Caldwell and felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my mind. I told him to prepare the official fraud affidavits and contact the authorities immediately. The days of keeping the peace and protecting their fake reputation were officially over. I was going to make sure they paid for every single stolen cent. I walked out of the towering glass office building and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. The cool breeze off the harbor did nothing to chill the absolute fire burning inside my chest. I unlocked the Shelby and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Before I drove away, I needed to do one more thing. I needed to hear it directly from him. I wanted to hear the exact tone of voice my brother would use to justify destroying my entire future. I pulled out my phone and dialed Trey's number. I fully expected it to go straight to voicemail, assuming he was still sitting in a holding cell waiting for a bail bondsman. But after only 3 rings, the line clicked open. The sound of clinking silverware and soft background music filtered through the speaker. My parents must have drained the absolute last of their hidden reserves, or pawned something incredibly valuable to get their golden child out just in time for a late lunch. Trey answered the phone with a loud, arrogant sigh. He did not sound humbled or traumatized by his night in jail. He sounded deeply annoyed that I was interrupting his afternoon. "What do you want, Audrey?" He snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you are calling to gloat, you can save it. Mom and Dad already took care of the bail, and the lawyers are going to get those ridiculous trespassing charges dropped by tomorrow morning. You really thought you could ruin my wedding week over a stupid misunderstanding at a junkyard?" I kept my voice deadly quiet and perfectly steady. "I did not call to talk about the impound lot, Trey," I said. "I called to talk about the $85,000 of unsecured debt attached to my Social Security number. I called to talk about the predatory auto loan for your precious Chevrolet, the maxed-out luxury credit cards, and the 2-carat diamond engagement ring currently sitting on Chelsea's finger." There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I expected him to panic. I expected him to stumble over his words or frantically deny it or even offer a fake, terrified apology. Instead, a low, chilling sound came through the speaker. Trey was laughing. It was a genuine, amused chuckle, as if I had just told a mildly entertaining joke at a dinner party. "Oh, that," he said, completely brushing off a massive federal crime as if it was a minor inconvenience. "Look, Audrey, do not be so incredibly dramatic. Mom and Dad said you did not need a high credit score anyway. You are just sitting in your apartment selling old clothes on the internet. You do not have a real career, and you are certainly not trying to buy a house anytime soon. We needed the money for the wedding and to keep up the family image at the church. Family is supposed to sacrifice for each other. You should be proud that your clean credit history is helping me build a beautiful life with Chelsea. I sat in my car listening to the absolute peak of his delusion. He truly believed that my entire existence was meant to serve as a financial stepping stone for his happiness. He felt completely justified in stealing my identity, because in his mind my life had absolutely no value compared to his. I asked him how he could possibly think he would get away with federal bank fraud. I asked him if he really thought I would just sit back, remain silent, and pay off his luxury debts for the next 20 years while he played the perfect successful son. "What are you gonna do, Audrey?" Trey mocked, his tone turning incredibly vicious and cruel. "Are you really going to call the police and put your own mother in a jail cell? Are you going to send Dad to federal prison over some plastic cards and a car loan? You do not have the guts to do that. You have always been weak, and you have always backed down when Mom yells at you. Besides, you are too late anyway. We are already completely untouchable." I narrowed my eyes and asked him exactly what he meant by that. Trey let out a smug, arrogant breath. He was so eager to put me in my place and prove his superiority that he could not resist bragging about their next master plan. He told me that Mom and Dad were meeting with a private mortgage broker this exact afternoon. He proudly announced that they were taking out a massive $100,000 home equity loan against Grandpa Pop's house. He said they were going to use the fresh cash to quietly pay off the worst of the credit cards in my name and fund the most lavish wedding reception this city had ever seen. They actually think they inherited the house, I realized with a sudden sharp clarity. Pops had let them live there rent-free for over a decade, but the deed had always remained firmly in his name. Trey bragged that the private broker was rushing the paperwork through and the cash would be sitting safely in their bank accounts by Friday morning, just in time for the rehearsal dinner. He told me I was completely outplayed by people who actually knew how the world worked. He suggested that I should just show up to the Thanksgiving family cookout tomorrow, apologize to everyone for my recent behavior, and gracefully accept my place at the bottom of the family ladder. He told me to wear something nice for once so I would not embarrass Chelsea in the background of the wedding photos, and then he hung up the phone. The line went dead, leaving a heavy silence in the cabin of my car. I lowered my phone and stared straight out the windshield of the classic muscle car. Trey thought he had just delivered a crushing, flawless victory speech. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the final critical piece of the puzzle. He did not know that the house he was bragging about leveraging was legally sitting inside an irrevocable trust with my name as the sole beneficiary. He did not know that any mortgage contract my parents tried to sign today would be instantly flagged as blatant real estate fraud by the title company. I started the engine of the Shelby, letting the powerful roar fill the concrete parking garage and echo off the walls. My parents were not just digging a hole anymore. They were actively building their own tomb, and I was going to bring the entire heavy-duty towing fleet to help bury them. The sun rose on Thanksgiving morning, casting a golden glow over the sprawling suburban neighborhood. At the house of my parents, the preparations for the massive dual celebration were already in full swing. This was not just a traditional family Thanksgiving dinner. It was the official engagement party for Trey and Chelsea, and my parents had spared absolutely no expense. They had rented massive white tents for the backyard, hired a professional catering staff to handle the overflow, and ordered extravagant floral arrangements that lined the entire driveway. Every single detail was meticulously designed to project an image of overwhelming wealth and perfect Christian family harmony. Of course, I knew the dark truth. Every single flower, every catered appetizer, and every rented chair was paid for by the massive fraudulent home equity loan they were desperately trying to push through the bank. Inside the house, the atmosphere was buzzing with loud conversations and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. The entire extended family was there, along with half of the church congregation. In the center of the massive kitchen, my mother Valerie was holding court. She stood at the marble island, surrounded by my aunts, uncles, and several senior members of the church choir. She was aggressively chopping vegetables while putting on the absolute performance of her lifetime. She had perfectly applied waterproof mascara just so she could carefully dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief without ruining her makeup. Valerie leaned over the counter and lowered her voice to that dramatic theatrical whisper she always used when she was about to assassinate the character of someone. She told Aunt Brenda and Uncle Calvin that I had completely lost my mind. She spun a wild, deeply fabricated story about how I had manipulated Grandpa Pops in his final days, taking advantage of his failing memory to trick him into signing the towing company over to me. She actually squeezed out a few real tears as she described how heartbroken she was that her own daughter would steal the rightful inheritance of her brother. The lies did not stop there. Valerie went on to tell the horrified relatives about the incident at the police station. She completely omitted the fact that Trey and Chelsea were caught on camera breaking into a secure commercial facility. Instead, she claimed that Trey had simply gone to the lot to pick up a car that Pops had promised him for the wedding, and that I had maliciously locked him inside and called the police out of pure bitter jealousy. She told everyone that I was trying to ruin the happiest week of the life of my brother because I was miserable and alone. The echo chamber in the kitchen immediately sprang into action. Aunt Brenda shook her head slowly, taking a sip of her white wine, and loudly declared that she always knew there was something wrong with my spirit. She said I was always too quiet and too secretive, and that a girl who spent all her time selling used clothes on the internet was bound to turn out bitter. Uncle Calvin agreed, puffing out his chest and stating that a commercial business should always go to the eldest son anyway, because women simply do not have the emotional stability to run a heavy machinery empire. Pastor Thomas, who was standing near the refrigerator, nodded solemnly. He told the gathered crowd that they all needed to pray for my troubled soul and that hopefully one day I would find the grace to apologize and return the stolen property to its rightful male owner. Out in the backyard under the massive white tents, Trey and Chelsea were basking in the glowing admiration of the guests. They were acting like absolute royalty. Chelsea was parading around in a custom white designer dress, holding a glass of champagne, and aggressively shoving her left hand into the face of anyone who walked by. She made sure every single guest got a close-up look at the flawless 2-carat diamond engagement ring sitting on her finger. She laughed loudly, telling all the church ladies how Trey had saved up for years to buy it for her, completely ignoring the fact that the diamond was currently destroying my personal credit score. Trey was standing near the outdoor bar, surrounded by his old high school friends and a few younger cousins. He was loudly bragging about his future plans. He told them that he was about to take over as the chief executive of Lincoln Towing and Salvage by early next week. He claimed that my little legal stunt was just a temporary delay, and that his expensive lawyers were currently crushing me in court. He even pointed to the massive house behind him and confidently announced that his parents were gifting the property to him and Chelsea as a wedding present so they could start their family in a proper affluent neighborhood. The food spread was massive and entirely for show. Valerie had ordered roasted turkeys, honey-glazed hams, and endless trays of expensive side dishes. Derek was walking around the patio with a premium cigar, handing out expensive scotch to the men of the church. He was laughing and playing the role of the successful wealthy patriarch. He told everyone that the commercial towing business was expanding rapidly and that Trey was going to take the family legacy to the next level. Derek completely ignored the terrifying reality that his bank accounts were empty, that his credit was a total illusion, and that he was facing federal prison time for identity theft. The absolute audacity of their collective delusion was staggering. They were standing in a backyard they did not own, celebrating a business they did not control and showing off jewelry they bought with a stolen identity. They were surrounded by dozens of people who were actively praising them and tearing down my name. My parents had successfully built a massive fortress of lies protecting their golden child and painting me as the ultimate villain of the entire family. They felt completely invincible right there in that moment. They thought they had secured their fake legacy and that I was sitting alone in my downtown apartment, too intimidated and too ashamed to ever show my face around them again. But as they toasted to their fake wealth and laughed at my expense, they had absolutely no idea what was actually coming down the street. They had no idea that I was not the scared 15-year-old girl with a plastic bus pass anymore. I was the legally recognized owner of everything they were standing on. And I was currently driving toward that house with a briefcase full of federal fraud evidence, a pocket full of legal eviction notices, and an entire fleet of heavy-duty commercial tow trucks completely ready to tear their perfect suburban illusion straight down to the foundation. The loud chatter and smooth background music of the Thanksgiving engagement party were abruptly shattered by a sound that completely commanded the neighborhood. The deep ground-shaking roar of the 1967 Shelby GT 500 echoed down the suburban street. I turned the corner and slowly rolled toward my parents' house, letting the massive V8 engine rumble with pure, intimidating power. Through the tinted windshield, I could see the heads of every single guest turn toward the front yard. The laughter stopped, the clinking of glasses faded away, and the catering staff froze in their tracks. I pulled the gleaming classic muscle car right into the center of the driveway, positioning it so that it completely blocked the entrance. I shifted into park, turned the key, and killed the engine. The sudden silence that fell over the property was incredibly heavy and thick with tension. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped out onto the pavement. For my entire life, my family had only ever seen me dressed in faded jeans and oversized sweaters, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Today, I was taking up all the space. I was wearing an immaculate custom-tailored emerald green designer suit that I had purchased with the profits from my hidden vintage clothing empire. The raw silk fabric caught the afternoon sun perfectly, making me look like I had just stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. I paired the sharp suit with sleek black leather heels and dark oversized sunglasses. I did not look like the quiet, submissive daughter they could easily bully. I looked wealthy, I looked completely untouchable, and I looked absolutely lethal. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the heavy, worn leather briefcase that belonged to Grandpa Pops. I closed the car door with a solid, satisfying thud that echoed across the lawn. I walked up the long driveway with slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. As I approached the massive white tents in the backyard, the crowd of relatives physically parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to say a single word. Aunt Brenda, who had just been loudly assassinating my character in the kitchen, took a hurried step backward, clutching her glass of white wine tightly against her chest. Uncle Calvin stopped puffing on his premium cigar and just stared. I even saw Pastor Thomas standing near the buffet tables, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to reconcile the powerful, wealthy woman walking toward him with the broken scapegoat he had lectured in the living room just 2 days prior. My parents, Valerie and Derek, were standing near the patio, frozen in absolute shock. Valerie dropped the silver serving tongs she was holding, letting them clatter loudly onto the stone pavers. She looked at my designer suit, and then at the leather briefcase in my hand, and I could see the pure, raw panic instantly flood her eyes. She knew exactly what that briefcase meant. Derek tried to puff out his chest and step forward to block my path, but his legs seemed glued to the ground. They had spent the entire morning convincing the extended family that I was crazy and broke, but my grand entrance had just instantly shattered their entire carefully constructed narrative. Before Derek could even open his mouth to demand that I leave, the heavy silence was violently broken by the sound of heels stomping aggressively across the wooden deck. Chelsea was marching straight toward me, pushing her way through the crowd of stunned relatives. Her face was flushed a dark mottled red with pure, unadulterated anger, completely ruining her expensive bridal makeup. She had apparently spent the entire morning complaining to anyone who would listen about her miserable night in a city-holding cell. Seeing me standing there completely calm and dressed in a suit that easily cost more than her entire wedding dress pushed her right over the edge of sanity. Chelsea stopped just inches away from my face, invading my personal space. She raised her hand and shoved her perfectly manicured finger right at my nose. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here today after pressing criminal charges against us," Chelsea hissed, her voice shrill and loud enough for every single guest in the quiet yard to hear. You locked us in a disgusting junkyard and made me sleep on a freezing concrete floor like an animal. You are completely psychotic, Audrey, and you are ruining my entire wedding week just because you are a sad, lonely girl who is desperately jealous of my life. The entire backyard held its collective breath, waiting to see if I would cry or run away or apologize like I always did when confronted by the golden child and his inner circle. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked down at her shaking finger pointing right in my face. I calmly raised my left hand and swatted her finger away from me with a swift dismissive motion, as if she were nothing more than a mildly annoying insect buzzing around my head. I reached up and slowly took off my dark, oversized sunglasses, looking her dead in the eyes. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, letting her feel the absolute freezing weight of my stare. I am not here for the turkey. Chelsea, I said, my voice perfectly level and projecting clearly across the dead silent backyard. I am here to clean house. Chelsea gasped, clutching her chest as if I had just physically struck her. Trey, who had been hiding near the outdoor bar, finally found his fake courage and jogged over to stand next to his fiancée. He tried to look intimidating, but I could see the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. "What is your problem, Audrey?" Trey demanded, trying to keep his voice deep and authoritative in front of his high school friends. "Mom and Dad told you to stay away until you were ready to apologize to us. You need to turn around, get back in that stolen car, and leave right now before I call the police and have you removed from our property for trespassing." I looked at Trey and let out a soft, genuine laugh. The irony of him threatening to call the police on me for trespassing after I had just bailed him out of a literal jail cell for the exact same crime was almost too perfect. I did not look at my parents, who were now frantically pushing their way through the crowd to intervene. I kept my eyes entirely locked on the golden child. I shifted the heavy leather briefcase to my left hand and reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored emerald suit. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade they had handed me and drop it right into the middle of their perfect, fake Thanksgiving celebration. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I did not say another word to Trey or Chelsea. I simply walked right past them, brushing my shoulder against Trey's perfectly pressed jacket. I marched straight across the manicured lawn toward the massive professional audio setup my parents had rented for the occasion. The DJ was a young guy from the neighborhood hired to play upbeat celebration music while everyone ate their expensive catered food. He looked completely confused as I approached his table. I did not ask for permission. I set the heavy leather briefcase down on the table, reached over his mixing board, and pulled the main audio cable right out of his laptop. The upbeat rhythm and blues music that had been filling the backyard cut off instantly, leaving a sharp, jarring silence in its wake. The DJ opened his mouth to protest, but I gave him a look so cold he immediately took a step back and raised his hands in surrender. I plugged the auxiliary cable directly into my phone and turned the master volume dial on the mixing board all the way up to the maximum level. I picked up the main wireless microphone that was resting on the table. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The heavy thud echoed loudly through the massive speakers positioned around the yard. Every single pair of eyes in the backyard was locked completely on me. "Since we are all gathered here today to celebrate family and honesty," I said, my voice booming across the lawn, "I thought it would only be appropriate to have a toast from the man who actually paid for the ground you are standing on. I know Grandpa Pops could not be here today, but he left a very special message just for Valerie, Derek, and the happy couple." I looked right at my mother, who was now gripping the back of a rented folding chair so hard her knuckles were completely white. I tapped the screen of my phone and pressed play on the digital audio file Mr. Caldwell had sent me that morning. For a brief second, there was a soft crackle of static over the massive speakers, and then the deep, gravelly, unmistakable voice of Grandpa Pops filled the entire neighborhood. The recording was crystal clear. It was a taped deposition between Pops and his estate lawyer. Pop's voice was not weak or fading. It was filled with a fiery, intense disgust. "I have reviewed the private investigator files," Pop's voice thundered through the speakers. "Valerie and Derek are absolute parasites, For years, I watched them try to drain my company dry to fund their fake holy lifestyle, but I never thought they would sink this low. They stole the social security number of their own daughter. They committed federal identity theft against Audrey just to buy a car for that lazy entitled boy Trey and to finance their luxury vacations. They have racked up nearly $100,000 of secret debt and completely destroyed the financial future of the only child in that house who actually works for a living. The voice of my grandfather echoed off the sides of the house and over the pristine white tents. Nobody in the yard even dared to breathe. I am changing the entire trust. Pop's voice continued dripping with absolute venom. I am cutting Valerie, Derek, and Trey completely out of the will. They get absolutely nothing. I am leaving 100% of the towing empire, the commercial real estate, and this very house to Audrey. She is the only one in this pathetic family with the intelligence, the work ethic, and the spine to crush them when the truth finally comes out. Let them try to fight her. She will destroy them and they will absolutely deserve it. The recording ended with the sharp click of a tape recorder turning off. I reached down and unplugged my phone from the mixing board. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck all the oxygen right out of the backyard. It was the sound of a carefully crafted 30-year illusion shattering into a million sharp pieces all at once. Somewhere in the middle of the frozen crowd, a heavy silver fork slipped from the fingers of Aunt Brenda and clattered loudly against a porcelain dinner plate. The sharp metallic sound made several people physically jump. I looked at my mother. Valerie's face had drained of all its color. Her perfectly applied blush now looked completely absurd against her chalk-white skin. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water, but no sound was coming out. She looked incredibly small and pathetic, stripped of all her fake religious righteousness. Derek was staring at the massive speakers as if Grandpa Pops was going to physically step out of them. His premium cigar had completely burned out in his hand, dropping ash onto his expensive shoes. Trey was standing next to Chelsea looking like he was about to be physically sick. The golden child had just been publicly humiliated and exposed as a massive fraud in front of his high school friends, his extended family, and the entire church congregation. The narrative that I was the crazy jealous sister was instantly obliterated by the booming voice of the patriarch they all respected and feared. The aunts and uncles who had just been nodding along with Valerie lies in the kitchen were now looking at my parents with pure, unadulterated horror. In our community, identity theft was an unforgivable crime, but stealing the identity of your own child to pamper a lazy adult son was a sin that no amount of Sunday church attendance could ever wash away. Pastor Thomas looked absolutely disgusted, physically taking a step away from the buffet table and shaking his head. They were all doing the mental math, realizing that the massive engagement party, the expensive catered food, and the giant diamond ring Chelsea was wearing were all paid for with stolen money and federal bank fraud. Chelsea looked down at her own hand, staring at the 2-carat diamond ring, as if it had suddenly caught fire. She slowly turned to look at Trey, her eyes wide with shock, and the dawning realization that the wealthy, successful man she thought she was marrying was actually a broke, unemployed criminal, living entirely off the stolen credit of his younger sister. The trap had been perfectly sprung, and my parents were caught right in the center of it with absolutely nowhere to hide. They had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage while building a fake empire on my name, and now the entire neighborhood was watching that empire burn straight to the ground. Aunt Brenda was the first person to actually move. She set her white wine glass down on a nearby table with a loud clank and took several deliberate steps away from Valerie. In our community, you could excuse a lot of things. You could excuse being a bit too boastful or throwing a party you could not really afford. But stealing the social security number of your own child was an absolute line in the sand. It was the ultimate betrayal of the family unit. The church ladies who had just been comforting my mother and agreeing with her vicious lies were now staring at her as if she were a complete stranger. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of deep disappointment. He looked at Derek and then at Valerie, shaking his head slowly. He told them that what they had done was not just a legal crime, but a massive moral failure. He said they had used the church and their community as a shield to hide their own wicked actions. Valerie began to panic. Her eyes darted wildly around the yard, searching for just one sympathetic face, but she found absolutely nothing. The echo chamber she had relied on for her entire life had instantly collapsed. She held her hands out, palms up, and let out a pathetic, trembling laugh, trying to wave the entire situation away. "It is not what it sounds like," Valerie stammered, her voice completely losing its usual commanding tone. Pops was just confused. "You all know how he gets. He was always so dramatic. It was not stealing. We are family and family shares everything." Audrey did not even need her credit score anyway. She just sits in her apartment selling old clothes. Trey is the one who needed a fair start. He is a man building a future. He needed a reliable car for his career, and he needed to provide a proper ring for his beautiful bride. "I was just trying to help my son." Audrey would not mind. She has always been so accommodating to us. She was actually doubling down. Even with the voice of my grandfather echoing in her ears and the entire neighborhood staring at her in disgust, Valerie was still trying to play the victim. She still believed that my entire existence was meant to be sacrificed on the altar of my brother. I watched her desperately try to spin federal bank fraud into an act of maternal love, and I felt a wave of absolute cold clarity. I did not need to yell. I did not need to cry. I had something so much more powerful than tears. I walked over to the long wooden picnic table that was covered in expensive catered appetizers and crystal champagne flutes. I grabbed the edge of the crisp white linen tablecloth and pulled it hard. The expensive trays of food, the crystal glasses, and the floral centerpieces crashed onto the grass with a massive shattering sound. Nobody moved to stop me. I set my heavy leather briefcase right in the center of the cleared wooden table. I unbuckled the brass clasps and pulled out the thick manila folder that Mr. Caldwell had given me that morning. I opened the folder and took out the heavy stack of official credit reports, bank statements, and fraudulent loan applications. I raised the stack of papers high in the air so every single person in the backyard could see the bold red ink and the official bank logos. I slammed the entire stack down onto the wooden picnic table with a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. $85,000, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a knife. That is exactly how much debt is currently sitting under my name. You ruined my personal credit score and committed federal fraud just to buy a car for a 31-year-old boy who refuses to work, and a massive diamond ring for a woman who does nothing but disrespect this family. I pointed to the top page of the stack, tapping my finger against the fraudulent signature. You forged my name on 3 different luxury credit cards, Valerie. You maxed them out on expensive vacations and designer clothes so you could parade around the church acting like you were rich. And Derek, you co-signed a predatory auto loan using the social security number of an 18-year-old girl. You both lied to the banks, you lied to Grandpa Pops, and you lied to every single person standing in this yard today. I looked over at Chelsea, who was now practically hyperventilating, trying to twist the diamond ring off her finger as if it were burning her skin. "And you, Chelsea," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on her terrified face. "You loved bragging about how much Trey sacrificed to buy you that ring. Well, the truth is, he did not pay a single cent for it. My ruined credit score paid for it. Every time you flashed that rock in my face, you were flaunting stolen property." Trey tried to step forward, but Uncle Calvin put a heavy hand firmly on his chest, pushing him back. "Do not take another step, boy." Uncle Calvin growled, his voice full of absolute contempt. "You let your parents steal from your own sister so you could drive a fancy car and play pretend. You are not a man. You are a complete disgrace to the family name." The church choir ladies began whispering furiously among themselves, pointing at Valerie and shaking their heads. Aunt Brenda spoke up again, her voice shaking with anger. She looked at Valerie and asked how she could possibly sit in the front pew every single Sunday preaching about honesty and grace while secretly destroying the life of her youngest child. Brenda said it was pure evil to use a child like a credit card, and she would make sure the entire congregation knew exactly what kind of people Valerie and Derek truly were. Pastor Thomas agreed completely. He walked over to the picnic table and looked down at the documents I had scattered across the wood. He did not need to touch them to see the truth. The official bank letterheads and the glaring numbers spoke for themselves. He turned back to my parents and announced that they were no longer welcome to serve on the church council. He told them that until they repented and faced the legal consequences of their actions, they were spiritually suspended from the community they had worked so hard to impress. Valerie collapsed against the side of the buffet table, sobbing hysterically, but this time they were not fake tears carefully designed to manipulate a crowd. They were real, ugly tears of absolute terror. She knew that the papers sitting on that picnic table were enough to send her to federal prison. Derek was completely silent. His face was gray, and he was staring at the stack of bank statements as if he were looking at his own death warrant. The perfect suburban illusion was completely shattered, exposing the rotting foundation they had built their entire lives upon. And I was not finished yet. Derek had been completely silent up until this exact moment. He had watched the stack of bank statements hit the table, and he had watched his wife collapse into a sobbing mess, but he had not moved a single muscle. His entire identity was built on the concept of being the ultimate untouchable patriarch of our family. He demanded absolute respect and blind submission from everyone under his roof. For 28 years he had controlled me with nothing more than a stern look or a raised voice. He dictated what I wore, where I went, and how I spoke. But as he looked around the beautifully decorated backyard and saw the absolute disgust on the faces of his friends and the church elders, his fragile ego completely shattered. The public exposure of his financial crimes and his moral bankruptcy was simply too much for his pride to handle. The shock on his face rapidly mutated into pure, violent rage. He stomped across the manicured lawn, kicking a fallen crystal champagne flute out of his way without even looking down. The heavy footsteps of my father echoed across the wooden deck as he marched directly toward the picnic table where I was standing. His face was flushed a dangerous dark purple, and the thick veins on his neck were visibly bulging against his stiff white shirt collar. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were stark white. He thought he could just use his physical size and his booming voice to intimidate me into submission and force me to hand over the evidence. He thought I was still that terrified little girl who used to hide in her bedroom when he started shouting about the household bills. "You disrespectful little brat!" Derek roared, his voice cracking with unchecked aggression. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the wooden picnic table, right next to the stack of fraudulent loan applications, making the remaining glasses jump and shatter on the grass. "You do not air family business in public. You do not come into my house and humiliate your mother in front of our guests. Give me those papers right now, Audrey. Hand them over and get off my property before I teach you a lesson about respect." He reached out with his thick fingers, trying to grab the manila folder and the bank statements, but I was much faster. I placed my hands flat down on top of the documents, pressing them firmly against the wood. I did not flinch. I did not look away, and I certainly did not step back. I stood my ground, completely unfazed by his sudden outburst of anger. I looked up at the towering figure of my father, and I felt absolutely nothing but pity for the small, weak man standing in front of me. All of his bluster and his fake religious authority had evaporated, leaving nothing but a desperate thief trying to hide his crimes. He took another step forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to cast a physical shadow over me. His chest was heaving, and I could smell the stale, expensive scotch on his breath. For a second, the entire backyard held its breath, assuming that I was going to finally break under the intense physical pressure of the patriarch. Aunt Brenda let out a small, terrified gasp, and Uncle Calvin took a hesitant step forward as if he was preparing to physically intervene. The silence was incredibly tense, broken only by the sound of Valerie weeping near the buffet. I stepped right up to him, closing the distance until we were practically chest to chest. I tilted my head up and looked him dead in the eyes with an expression of absolute freezing calm. "Touch me, and you will be joining your golden sun in a city holding cell tonight," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of any fear. "I promise you, Derek, the police will be incredibly interested to see the federal fraud evidence I have sitting right here under my hands." The use of his first name completely stunned him. I had never called him Derek in my entire life. It was the ultimate verbal removal of his authority. It stripped away his title of father and reduced him to exactly what he was: a desperate criminal trying to bully his way out of a massive federal indictment. He stared down at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and uncontrollable fury. He realized in that exact moment that his physical intimidation was completely useless against me. I held all the cards, I owned the entire deck, and he was completely morally and financially bankrupt. But his fragile ego simply could not accept the defeat. The public humiliation of being challenged and beaten by his scapegoat daughter in front of the entire neighborhood pushed him completely over the edge of reason. He gritted his teeth, letting out a low, guttural sound of pure, violent frustration. He pulled his right arm back, raising his heavy hand high into the air. He was actually going to strike me right there in the middle of the Thanksgiving party in front of the pastor and all of his church friends. Valerie screamed something from the buffet table, and Trey took a sudden, terrified step backward. I did not close my eyes, and I did not raise my arms to block him. I just kept my eyes locked onto his, waiting for him to make the final catastrophic mistake of his life. Just as Derek began to swing his heavy hand downward, the crisp afternoon air was violently ripped apart by a sound so loud it physically vibrated the ground beneath our feet. It was the heavy air-splitting blast of a massive commercial truck horn. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street, drowning out every other noise in the neighborhood, and vibrating through the chests of everyone standing in the yard. Derek froze instantly, his hands suspended mid-air, his eyes darting toward the front yard in sheer panic. The horn blasted a second time, longer and more aggressive than the first. It was the sound of heavy machinery, the sound of absolute authority, and the sound of my grandfather's legacy arriving to collect its dues. I smiled, a cold, hard smile, looking at my father, frozen in fear. The cavalry had officially arrived. Derek lowered his hands slowly as the massive vehicles turned the corner onto our quiet suburban street. It was not just one tow truck. It was an entire convoy of 3 massive heavy-duty commercial wreckers from the Lincoln Towing and Salvage Fleet. They rolled down the pavement in perfect formation, moving with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a military battalion. The massive chrome grills gleamed in the late afternoon sun, and the bright amber warning lights flashing on top of their cabs painted the entire neighborhood and the white rented party tents in a rhythmic, sweeping yellow glow. The deep, throaty rumble of the 3 diesel engines completely drowned out the soft background music and the terrified whispers of the party guests. The lead truck, a massive flatbed designed for luxury vehicle transport, pulled directly up to the curb, blocking the front path to the house. The second and third trucks, heavy-duty wreckers designed to haul industrial loads, angled themselves perfectly across the street, completely barricading the long concrete driveway. They boxed in every single car parked near the property, creating an impenetrable wall of steel and flashing lights. Sitting right there in the center of the driveway, completely exposed and trapped, were the absolute symbols of my parents' financial fraud. Trey, pristine Chevrolet, and Chelsea, brand new luxury sport utility vehicle, were parked side by side, gleaming under the flashing amber lights, like sitting ducks waiting for the slaughter. The absolute scale of the commercial trucks made the sprawling colonial house and the fancy parked cars look suddenly incredibly small and fragile. Trey had managed to fix himself a massive plate of catered food during the confrontation, but as the massive trucks locked their air brakes with a deafening hiss, his hands began to violently shake. The expensive porcelain plate slipped from his grip and crashed onto the wooden deck, sending crab cakes and expensive cocktail sauce splattering across the polished floorboards and onto his expensive leather shoes. He stared at the fleet of wreckers with his mouth hanging open, the color completely draining from his face. He knew exactly what those trucks were designed to do, and he knew exactly whose name was printed in massive silver letters on the sides of their thick steel doors. Chelsea grabbed the sleeve of his jacket, digging her manicured nails deep into the expensive fabric. "What is happening?" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing over the idling diesel engines. "Why are those disgusting trucks blocking my guests? Trey, tell them to move right now. Call your father and tell him to call the police on these people." But Trey could not speak. He just stood there completely paralyzed, watching the heavy machinery idle menacingly outside the sanctuary of his childhood home. Chelsea turned frantically toward the patio, looking for someone to save her perfect day. "Derek, do something," she yelled, stamping her foot on the deck. "Do not just let them park there and ruin the aesthetic of my engagement party." The church ladies and the extended relatives who had been paralyzed by the federal fraud documents scattered on the picnic table now flocked toward the front lawn, drawn by the massive spectacle unfolding in the street. Aunt Brenda clutched her chest, watching the heavy chains swing from the back of the wreckers. Valerie was still weeping softly by the buffet table, completely unable to process the total destruction of her perfect public image. She had spent her entire life worrying about what the neighbors thought, and now every single neighbor on the street was standing on their porches watching a fleet of tow trucks raid her home. Derek stood frozen near the picnic table, his chest heaving, his fist still loosely clenched at his side. His violent rage had been entirely extinguished, replaced by the cold, terrifying realization that he possessed absolutely zero power to stop what was about to happen. Pastor Thomas simply stood on the edge of the grass, watching silently as the inevitable consequences of their massive deception arrived to collect the debt. I turned my back on my father, completely dismissing his presence. I did not need to run or hide from his fake authority anymore. I walked with slow, deliberate steps across the green lawn, leaving the scattered bank statements, the shattered champagne flutes, and the ruined engagement party behind me. My emerald green designer suit caught the flashing amber lights of the tow trucks as I approached the massive lead flatbed. The heavy door of the cab swung open, and the lead driver stepped out onto the pavement. It was Marcus, the senior operator who had delivered the Shelby to me just yesterday morning. He was a tall, imposing man who had worked for Grandpa Pops for over 20 years, and he had absolutely no love for Valerie or Derek, having watched them disrespect his boss for decades. Marcus adjusted his heavy leather work gloves and looked over the chaotic scene of the Thanksgiving party. He looked at the terrified relatives, the weeping mother, and the frozen patriarch, standing defeated by the picnic table. Then he looked down at me, offering a deep, respectful nod that acknowledged my absolute authority over the entire operation. "We received the emergency dispatch from the downtown office boss," Marcus said, his voice deep and entirely professional, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "We have the legal paperwork verified by the local magistrate, and the local precinct has been notified of the active asset recovery action. We are completely ready to proceed on your command." I looked past Marcus at the second and third drivers who had already stepped out of their cabs, unhooking heavy steel chains and preparing the massive hydraulic lifts. They moved with absolute precision, a highly trained team executing a perfectly coordinated strike against the people who thought they were completely above the law. I turned my head slightly, looking back over my shoulder at Trey, who was now standing at the edge of the lawn, watching his entire fake wealthy life flash before his eyes. He tried to take a slow step toward me, holding his hand out in a pathetic, silent plea for mercy, but he was far too late for apologies. I turned back to Marcus, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of 30 years of emotional abuse and family trauma, finally lifting completely off my shoulders. "Execute the repossession orders," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying clearly over the loud rumble of the idling diesel engines. "Execute all of them right now." Marcus gave me a sharp nod and raised his gloved hand high into the air, signaling the other drivers to move in. The heavy hydraulic lifts began to hum loudly, and the massive steel arms lowered toward the driveway pavement. The absolute dismantling of the Golden Child had officially begun. Marcus lowered his gloved hand, and the driver of the second heavy-duty wrecker instantly shifted his massive truck into gear. The deep growl of the diesel engine revving up sent a physical vibration through the concrete driveway. The driver expertly spun the large steering wheel, backing the massive steel machine right toward Trey, prized gleaming Chevrolet. The loud, rhythmic beeping of the reverse warning alarm echoed across the manicured lawn, sounding like a countdown to absolute disaster for my brother. Trey finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward, sprinting across the driveway and waving his arms frantically in the air, as if he could physically stop the 10-ton commercial vehicle with his bare hands. "Stop the truck," Trey screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Turn that engine off right now. You cannot touch that car. It belongs to me." The tow truck driver did not even blink. He backed up until the heavy steel bumper of the wrecker was just inches away from the front grille of the Chevrolet. He locked the air brakes with a loud, sharp hiss and stepped out of the cab. He was a broad-shouldered man, wearing a high-visibility safety vest, and he completely ignored Trey's frantic screaming. He walked to the back of his truck, grabbed the heavy remote control unit, and hit a thick rubber button. The heavy hydraulic winch began to hum, and the thick steel cables slowly unspooled, lowering the heavy lifting arm toward the driveway pavement. Trey ran up to the operator and actually tried to grab his arm. "Do not touch my car!" Trey yelled, his face red and covered in sweat. "My parents bought this for me in cash 13 years ago. I have the registration in the glove box. You are stealing private property and I am going to have you arrested." The operator simply stepped back, shaking off Trey's hand with a look of absolute boredom. He looked over at me, waiting for the final confirmation. I nodded my head once. The operator knelt down and expertly slid the heavy steel hooks under the front chassis of the Chevrolet. The loud metallic clank of the hooks locking securely onto the frame sounded like a prison door slamming shut. Trey spun around and glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You are a completely insane, jealous lunatic," Audrey Trey screamed across the driveway. "You cannot legally do this. That car is my personal property. Mom and Dad gave it to me for my 15th birthday, while you got nothing. It is mine, and you know it." I took a few slow, measured steps across the concrete walking, right up to the edge of the idling tow truck. I looked at the shiny paint job on the Chevrolet. I remembered the morning he got it. I remembered standing on the porch holding my cheap plastic bus pass, while he revved the engine and my parents clapped and cheered. For 13 long years, that car was the ultimate physical symbol of his golden child status and my complete worthlessness in the eyes of our parents. Every single time he washed it in the driveway, he was quietly reminding me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I turned my head and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for the entire crowd of silent relatives to hear every single word. "You are wrong, Trey," I said, keeping my tone completely level. "Mom and Dad did not buy you this car in cash. They financed it. And they did not use their own names because their credit was already completely ruined. They stole my social security number when I turned 18, and they put the loan entirely in my name." Trey opened his mouth to argue, but the words completely died in his throat. He looked over at Valerie, who was still weeping softly by the buffet table, refusing to make eye contact with him. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. "The loan is in my name, Trey," I continued, taking one step closer to him. "Which means the bank considers me the sole legal owner of this vehicle. And since I have deliberately chosen not to pay the massive monthly bill for the last 6 months, the lender issued an active repossession order. So no, Trey. I am not stealing your car. My commercial towing company is simply executing a legal repossession of my own defaulted asset." I turned to the tow truck operator and gave him a sharp nod. "Lift it," I ordered. The operator pressed the heavy rubber button on his remote control. The massive hydraulic winch engaged with a loud mechanical groan. The thick steel cables pulled tight, completely lifting the front tires of the prized Chevrolet right off the concrete driveway. Trey let out a loud, pathetic cry, reaching his hands out as if he wanted to hold the car down by force. But the heavy machinery was completely unforgiving. The winch whined loudly, and the car was hoisted high into the air, suspended helplessly behind the heavy-duty wrecker. The visual impact of the moment was absolutely devastating. The beautiful shining symbol of my brother, endless entitlement, was literally dangling in the air, completely out of his control. He dropped his arms to his sides, his shoulders slumping in total absolute defeat. He had spent his entire life believing he was superior to me simply because our parents told him he was. He believed that he was destined for greatness, and that I was destined to serve him. But standing there with his expensive shoes covered in ruined crab cakes, watching his only valuable possession get hauled away by a girl he had mocked for 13 years, he finally realized the absolute truth. He owned absolutely nothing. He had achieved absolutely nothing. He was just a grown man playing dress-up using stolen money and completely supported by the sister he had treated like garbage. I stood there watching the car sway gently from the heavy steel chains. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or hesitation. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of pure justice. The heavy burden of being the family scapegoat was finally and permanently lifted. But the repossession order was not finished yet, and the golden child was not the only one who needed to learn a very harsh lesson about stealing from me. I turned my attention away from the dangling Chevrolet and looked straight at the terrified woman standing by the patio. It was time for Chelsea to pay her debts. As the prized Chevrolet swayed gently in the air, the driver of the second heavy-duty wrecker did not waste a single second. He climbed back into his cab and shifted the massive gears. The deep rumble of the engine roared back to life, and the second truck began to slowly reverse toward the sleek white luxury sport utility vehicle, parked right next to where the Chevrolet used to be. It was Chelsea's brand-new fully loaded SUV. She had spent the entire morning of the party making sure every single guest walked past it so she could brag about the custom leather interior and the premium sound system. She had told everyone that Trey had bought it for her as an early wedding present to drive their future children around the affluent suburbs. Chelsea watched the massive steel bumper of the tow truck inch closer to her pristine white car, and her entire face contorted into a mask of pure hysteria. She let out a piercing shriek and sprinted across the driveway, completely abandoning her ruined engagement party aesthetic. She threw herself between the back of the tow truck and the hood of her luxury vehicle, holding her hands up in the air as if she were stopping traffic. "You back that disgusting truck up right now!" Chelsea screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Do not even think about touching my car. This is a private luxury vehicle, and if you scratch the paint, I am going to sue you and your entire junkyard company into absolute bankruptcy." The tow truck operator simply hit the air brakes, stopping the heavy vehicle with a loud hiss. He did not look angry or intimidated. He just looked incredibly tired of dealing with entitled people. He rested his arm out the window of his cab and looked over at me, waiting for instructions. I walked slowly across the concrete driveway, stopping just a few feet away from where Chelsea was standing guard over her completely fraudulent prize. She was hyperventilating her perfect white designer dress, now stained with sweat, and her face streaked with ruined makeup. "You cannot do this!" Audrey, Chelsea spat at me, her eyes wide and wild. "You already took your revenge on Trey. Leave my stuff alone. My name is on the registration of this car. It belongs to me, and you have absolutely no legal right to touch it. I am calling my lawyer right this second, and I am pressing charges against you for harassment and illegal seizure of property." I did not raise my voice, and I did not let her aggressive panic break my absolute calm. I reached into the heavy leather briefcase that I had carried with me across the yard and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed document bearing the official seal of a major national bank. I held the paper out so she could see the bold black text printed across the top. "You are right about one thing, Chelsea," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Your name is indeed on the registration, but the down payment for this luxury vehicle was not paid for with your money, and it certainly was not paid for with the money of my brother." Chelsea stopped screaming for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting from the piece of paper to my face. I read the document out loud so the crowd of relatives standing on the lawn could hear every single damning detail. I explained that the massive $20,000 down payment required to drive that vehicle off the dealership lot was paid using a platinum luxury credit card. I looked right at Chelsea and told her that the credit card used was the exact same fraudulent card my mother Valerie had illegally opened using my social security number. Chelsea's face went completely blank. The aggressive entitlement drained right out of her, leaving behind a hollow look of absolute dread. She slowly lowered her arms from the hood of the car. "That is fraud, Chelsea," I said, taking one step closer to her. "My lawyer submitted this evidence to the bank first thing this morning. When the fraud department realized the down payment was made with stolen funds, they immediately canceled the transaction and voided the title. You do not own this car. The bank owns this car, and they have contracted Lincoln Towing to return their stolen property immediately. The car goes back right now." I nodded to the tow truck operator. He did not hesitate. He engaged the heavy hydraulic winch, and the steel cables began to lower toward the driveway. Chelsea scrambled out of the way as the heavy steel hooks slid under the front chassis of her pristine white sport utility vehicle. The loud clank of the metal locking into place sounded like the final nail in the coffin of her fake wealthy lifestyle. She stood on the edge of the driveway and watched in absolute horror as the heavy winch pulled tight, lifting the front tires of her dream car off the ground. Trey walked slowly across the driveway, his shoulders slumped and his head hanging low. He reached out and tried to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It is going to be okay, baby," Trey mumbled, his voice weak and completely defeated. "We will figure this out. We can hire a lawyer and fight her in court. We still have each other and we are getting married this weekend." Chelsea turned and looked at him as if he were a completely disgusting stranger. She looked at his expensive clothes, stained with food, and then looked back at the 2 empty parking spots in the driveway. She looked over at the massive house, and then finally at the heavy stack of federal fraud documents still sitting on the picnic table. The brutal reality of her situation had finally crystallized in her mind. The man she was about to marry had absolutely no money, no cars, no house, and no future. He was completely dependent on the sister he had abused, and his parents were about to face serious prison time. "Do not touch me," Chelsea hissed, swatting his hand away with extreme force. "There is no we, Trey. You are completely broke. You lied to me about your job, you lied to me about your money, and you let your parents steal from your sister just to buy me things you could not actually afford. You are a complete broke loser." She reached down and grabbed the massive 2-carat diamond engagement ring on her left hand. She yanked it off her finger with so much force it looked like it actually hurt. She did not hand it back to him. She threw the heavy ring directly at his chest. The diamond bounced off his expensive jacket and clattered onto the hard concrete driveway, rolling away into the grass. "The wedding is completely cancelled," Chelsea shouted, her voice echoing through the dead silent neighborhood. "I am not marrying a broke loser who lives off the stolen credit of his younger sister. I am done with you, and I am done with this completely psychotic family." She did not wait for him to respond. She turned around and marched down the driveway in her expensive heels, walking right past the idling tow trucks and the flashing amber lights. She walked down the suburban street without looking back, leaving Trey standing completely alone in the empty driveway. The golden child had just lost his car, his inheritance, his fake reputation, and his bride, all in the span of 10 minutes. He dropped to his knees on the hard concrete, burying his face in his hands as the heavy tow truck hauled Chelsea luxury vehicle away down the street. The destruction of his perfect life was now absolute and complete. The second tow truck disappeared around the corner, carrying the white sport utility vehicle and leaving a heavy cloud of diesel exhaust hanging in the crisp afternoon air. The front driveway was now completely empty except for the dark grease stains on the concrete where the ultimate symbols of our family false wealth used to sit. Trey remained on his knees, staring blankly at the empty space, his expensive suit completely ruined and his spirit entirely broken. The absolute silence of the neighborhood was deafening, but it was soon shattered by the loud, desperate sobbing of my mother. Valerie had collapsed entirely onto the manicured green lawn. She was clutching the fabric of her expensive dress, rocking back and forth and wailing like a wounded animal. She was not just mourning the loss of the cars or the canceled wedding, she was watching her entire social circle completely dissolve right in front of her eyes. The church ladies she had spent decades trying to impress were actively turning their backs on her and walking quickly toward their cars. Aunt Brenda and Uncle Calvin did not even say goodbye. They just quietly slipped out the side gate, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a family facing federal bank fraud charges. Even the professional catering staff, sensing that the people who hired them were completely broke, began quietly packing up the expensive trays of food and carrying them back to their vans. Derek watched his friends leave, and the absolute reality of his complete social and financial destruction finally snapped whatever restraint he had left. He stomped across the grass, his face red with a mixture of sheer panic and pure, violent rage. He stopped just a few feet away from me, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You have completely ruined us," Derek screamed, his voice echoing off the brick facade of the large colonial house. "Are you happy now, Audrey? You have humiliated your mother, you have destroyed the wedding of your brother, and you have driven away every single friend we have in this community. You are a toxic, ungrateful child, and I will never forgive you for what you have done today." I just looked at him, feeling a deep and profound sense of peace. After everything that had just been exposed, the stolen identity, the $85,000 of debt, the lies and the manipulation, he was still desperately trying to play the victim. He still wanted to make me the villain of his story. Derek puffed out his chest, looking back at the massive house behind him as if he were drawing physical strength from the bricks and mortar. "You might have taken the business, and you might have taken the cars," Derek growled, taking a step toward me. "But you will never take our home. We still have this house. This is my property, and I am the head of this family. I am ordering you to get off my land right this second before I call the sheriff and have you thrown in a county cell for trespassing." I let him finish his desperate little speech. He truly believed that because they had lived in that massive house for over a decade, playing the role of the wealthy suburban family, that the property legally belonged to them. He was still clinging to the desperate delusion that his meeting with the private mortgage broker earlier that afternoon was going to save them. He thought he could still secure a $100,000 home equity loan to cover up his crimes and maintain his lavish lifestyle. I calmly reached into the inside pocket of my emerald green designer suit jacket. I did not pull out a heavy file or a thick stack of bank statements. I pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy parchment paper. It was a formal legal document bearing the raised golden seal of the county courthouse. I held the document in my hand and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward my father. I looked past him at the sprawling colonial house with its rented white tents and its expensive floral arrangements that were now blowing over in the wind. "About this house, Derek," I said, keeping my voice loud enough for Trey and Valerie to hear every single word. "You seem to be under the impression that Grandpa Pops left this property to you in his will. You seem to think that because he let you live here rent-free for 10 years so you could pretend to be successful, that you actually own the bricks and the land." Derek narrowed his eyes, his jaw clenching tightly. "He told me that Pops was his father, and the house was his rightful inheritance. He proudly stated that the deed naturally belonged to him because he was the patriarch." I shook my head slowly, letting out a soft, humorless laugh. "Pops did not leave this house to you." I explained my words, slicing through his delusion. "Pops actually owned the mortgage on this entire estate. He bought it in cash 15 years ago. And when he died, the deed did not transfer to you or Mom. The deed transferred directly into the irrevocable trust." And as I established earlier today with the audio recording and the legal documents, I am the sole beneficiary and the sole executor of that trust. Derek's face went completely slack. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The home equity loan he had been bragging about on the phone, the massive influx of cash they were planning to use to pay off their fraudulent debts, was completely impossible. No bank in the world would ever approve a mortgage for a man who did not even own the property he was trying to leverage. But that is not even the worst part, Derek. I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving tone. Because you thought you owned the house, you assumed you were responsible for the property taxes. But my audit of the company ledgers showed that you have not paid a single cent of property tax to the county in over 3 years. You spent that tax money on country club memberships, expensive suits, and church donations to feed your massive ego. I held out the heavy parchment paper, with the golden seal pressing it firmly against his chest until his shaking hands slowly came up to take it. That is a formal court-approved eviction notice, I announced. It was signed by a county judge at 9 o'clock this morning, since you are legally considered month-to-month tenants who are over 3 years delinquent on property taxes and have committed documented financial fraud against the legal property owner. You do not get the standard 30 days. Valerie stopped crying and looked up from the grass, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as the words finally registered in her mind. Trey slowly pushed himself up off the concrete, realizing that he did not just lose his car and his fiancée, he had just lost his childhood bedroom and his free ride. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up your personal belongings and vacate my property, I told them, my voice ringing with absolute finality. If you are not completely off these premises by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, the county sheriff will arrive to forcibly remove you and change all the locks. Derek looked down at the eviction notice in his hands, his eyes scanning the bold legal print and the undeniable signature of the judge. The paper shook violently in his grip. The fortress of expectations, the massive colonial home that my mother had used as her ultimate status symbol, was officially gone. The fake wealth, the stolen credit, the expensive cars, and the roof over their heads had all been completely stripped away in less than an hour. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The heavy parchment paper with the golden seal slipped from the trembling fingers of my father and fluttered down onto the manicured green lawn. It landed right next to a crushed crab cake and a shattered crystal champagne flute. The absolute finality of the eviction notice hung over the backyard like a thick, heavy fog. The extended family members who had lingered just long enough to witness the complete and total destruction of their golden boy, and the patriarch now began to move in total silence. There was no more whispering, and there was no more pointing. There was only a deep, suffocating disgust. The senior members of the church choir buttoned their coats and walked straight down the driveway, deliberately avoiding making any eye contact with my parents. Pastor Thomas stood at the edge of the grass for a long moment, shaking his head in profound sorrow before turning his back on them forever. He walked down the street toward his modest sedan, leaving his former star parishioners completely abandoned. The expensive professional catering staff did not even bother asking for their final payment, knowing full well that the accounts were empty and frozen. They quietly loaded the last of their silver warming trays into the back of their white vans and drove away without saying a single word. The sprawling suburban backyard that had been designed to host the most lavish and arrogant Thanksgiving engagement party in the history of the neighborhood was now reduced to a complete disaster zone. The crisp, white rented tents flapped sadly in the afternoon breeze, casting long, dark shadows over the overturned tables and the ruined floral arrangements. Sitting completely alone on the edge of the hard concrete curb was my brother Trey. The golden child had not moved an inch since Chelsea threw the 2-carat diamond ring at his chest. He was staring blankly at the dark grease stains on the pavement, where his prized Chevrolet had been parked just 30 minutes ago. He was completely car-less. He was entirely fiancé-less, and as of tomorrow afternoon, he would be officially homeless. His expensive tailored suit was stained and wrinkled, making him look exactly like the broke, unemployed fraud that he truly was. Derek stood frozen near the shattered remains of the picnic table. The man who had demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him was now completely broken. He looked at the empty driveway, and then down at his own shaking hands. He knew that the federal fraud documents were already in the hands of the authorities, and he knew that there was absolutely no escape from the legal nightmare waiting for him on Monday morning. His fake empire had completely collapsed and buried him under the rubble. Valerie let out a loud, pathetic wail and dragged herself across the grass toward me. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless now threw herself at my feet. Her expensive dress was covered in dirt, and her waterproof makeup had completely failed, leaving dark black streaks running down her cheeks. She reached out with her trembling hands and actually grabbed the hem of my emerald green designer suit pants. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes, completely stripping away her fake religious righteousness and replacing it with pure pathetic begging. "Please, Audrey," Valerie sobbed, her voice cracking and echoing in the empty yard. "Please do not do this to us. We are your family. I am your mother. You are my sweet daughter. We can fix this. We can go to counseling and we can be a real family now. Just please do not take the house away from us. I am begging you on my hands and knees, my sweet, beautiful girl. Please forgive me." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman clutching my ankle. I did not feel angry anymore, and I did not feel sad. I just felt completely empty when I looked at her. I thought about the 15-year-old girl who had stood on the front porch watching her brother get handed the keys to a brand new car. I thought about the worn-out plastic bus pass that she had shoved into my hand while telling me I needed to learn the value of hard work. I reached down and calmly peeled her dirty fingers off the fabric of my expensive suit. I took one step back, breaking the physical connection between us forever. "You gave me a bus pass, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, floating over the quiet yard. "You handed me that piece of plastic, and you told me that taking the bus every single day would build character." I looked right into her terrified eyes, watching the realization slowly wash over her face. "It really did build character, Mom," I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, absolute freeze. "It built the exact character of a chief executive officer who does not tolerate parasites." Valerie let out a devastating gasp and collapsed forward, burying her face in the grass and weeping uncontrollably. I did not offer her a tissue, and I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I turned my back on her and walked away. I walked across the ruined lawn, stepping over the shattered glass and the scattered bank statements. I walked down the long, empty concrete driveway, walking right past Trey, who did not even have the energy to look up at me. I reached the 1967 Shelby GT 500, parked at the end of the driveway. I opened the heavy metal door and slid into the driver's seat. The vintage leather felt cool and smooth against my skin. I inserted the silver key into the ignition and turned it. The massive V8 engine roared to life with a deep, ground-shaking rumble that completely drowned out the pathetic cries of my mother and the heavy silence of my father. I shifted the classic muscle car into gear and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. I pulled out of the suburban driveway and accelerated down the street, following the exact path of the massive Lincoln towing fleet that had just cleared the way for my new life. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden light across the city skyline in the distance. I looked up into the rearview mirror one final time. I saw the massive colonial house, the ruined white party tents, and the broken toxic people who had tried to destroy my future, slowly shrinking into the distance. They grew smaller and smaller until they completely vanished from my sight forever. I rolled the window down, letting the cool evening breeze blow through my hair. The screen fades to black as I drive the powerful muscle car toward a wealthy, independent, and completely free future. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood does not equal loyalty and sharing. DNA does not give anyone the right to destroy your future. For years, I believed that being a good daughter meant suffering in silence just to keep the peace. But I finally realized that true peace only comes when you establish firm boundaries against toxic behavior. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you. Walking away from abusive relatives to protect your own independence is the most powerful form of self-love you can practice in life. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story in the comments below.